This is a Squiz podcast. We're your shortcut to being informed.
Adam Harvey is one of our most experienced foreign correspondents, a one-time Asia correspondent and also Middle East correspondent. He's now a reporter for ABC's 7:30. In April, I interviewed Adam about the war between Israel and Hamas, and he gave incredible insights into how reporters work in a war zone, how they get their stories, and having been in Israel after the October 7 attacks, gave some context into what it was like on the ground. Adam went back to Israel just recently to report on the first anniversary of the October 7 attacks. So naturally, this conversation focuses a lot on that part of the story. But that's not all it's about. My curiosity was as much about how it was to go back, what has changed, and also knowing he was based in Beirut as a correspondent between 2008 and 2011, how he views the escalating war with the Iranian-backed Hezbollah. Some listening may have been to this part of the world since October 7, but most won't have. Adam has been there. And as a journalist in search of truth and interested in understanding the human experience of this conflict, I find him to be incredibly knowledgeable. He's helped me understand the complexities of the conflict, the need for empathy, and also he helps to give confidence that there are some bits we do know to be true. Some bits aren't complex. Some are just terrible. Adam speaks to all of this and sheds light on what being in Israel is like during this time. All right, Adam, you've just arrived back in Australia after a few weeks in Israel. The last time you were there was in the months after the October 7 attack. What's changed?
Well, the big change has been the war in the north. So Israel has gone from a nation that really felt like it was under attack, under siege, to there's a sense I felt from pretty much every Israeli I spoke to that finally the ball is back in their court, that they are taking on the real threat to Israel, which never was Hamas, the existential threat. It's Iran and Hezbollah in the north. You've had this situation where you've had tens of thousands, maybe 70,000 Israelis forced out of their home who used to live along the northern border, who now are living in hotels in Jerusalem or with family or in accommodation by the Dead Sea because of the constant missile fire that was coming over the northern border. So effectively, Israel had lost territory following the start of the war in Gaza following October 7 because Hezbollah started firing rockets at these northern communities in kind of support of Hamas and what was going on in Gaza. And Israelis felt that they needed to do something about it. And finally, in the last month or so, they have, and they've started firing back. There was a pager attack a couple of weeks ago where 1,800 pages that had been, it turned out, supplied by Israel to Hezbollah blew up simultaneously. The next day, you had hundreds of walkie-talkies exploded. A very targeted, precise operation that had been years in the making. And then we saw Israeli airstrikes expand in southern Lebanon, and now in the last 10 days or so, the Israeli ground invasion into northern Lebanon to try and push Hezbollah away from the border. So that's been the big shift, a nation on the defence to a nation on the attack, I think.
And is that, I mean, you spoke a little bit when we spoke in April about the mood being one of sorrow, one of fear in Israel. Is there a mood shift along with that change in perspective? And can you talk to that a little bit?
Yeah, it's funny, isn't it? Because really the threat is greater now. The attacks are constant. The rocket attacks are nightly, certainly on northern Israel, and they're even spreading down to the centre of the country, to Tel Aviv. But there is this sense this national mood that finally Israel is doing what's necessary, and that's attacking the enemy to the north. And yeah, like you said, there was this heavy kind of feel when I was there last November and December after the October 7 attacks, when Israelis felt that this terrible tragedy, and in fact, it wasn't just that they felt it; it was a terrible tragedy. The attacks on the communities around Gaza, the murders and the kidnappings had happened, and that heavy mood has kind of lifted a little bit. And there's a sense of purpose, I think, from a lot of Israelis that they're doing something, and there is a feeling that Israel will strike back against Iran as well now, because we've had the missile strikes come in from Iran to Israel, and the Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said he will retaliate. And undoubtedly that will happen. We don't know in what form, whether it'll be some sort of missile strike against an Iranian nuclear facility or a military base. But then there'll be another cycle of escalation. Iran has said it will respond to that. So who knows where that'll lead.
What is interesting, I guess, is that, just looking locally, what's happened over the weekend, so many out in the streets protesting against particularly the approach that Israel has had towards Gaza and now Lebanon. Many listening potentially, and many people are grappling with this idea, this positioning that Israel is under attack. It says, a lot of people saying that Israel's brought this on itself. How is that message being received by the people of Israel? Like, how much attention are they paying to those protests around the world?
Well, I think there is a lot of attention to those protests. They feel that a lot of Israelis, because it's a diverse country and there's a diversity of views, of course, a lot of people feel that the world doesn't understand the position that Israel is in, the fact that it's surrounded by countries that are determined to destroy it, and the notion of some sort of river to the sea Palestinian state means the end of Israel and the eviction of Israelis, and they see that as monumentally unfair. And but it's also worth pointing out that the kind of coverage we see in Australia, which is really Gaza focused, or has been for the last 12 months, the terrible civilian toll of the war in Gaza, the refugee crisis, the shifting of civilians from place to place to place. I mean, some of the people I've spoken to in Gaza have moved 4 or 5 times in that 12 months. That's not the coverage you see in Israel. It's war coverage that they're watching. They're watching Israeli journalists go on embeds inside Gaza, speaking to the Israeli commanders. The focus is on the death toll amongst Israeli troops. And now, over the last few weeks, it's all been back on October 7 as well, as a reminder of how all this started, which was a Hamas attack on Israel, an unprovoked Hamas attack on Israel, the Israelis say, that resulted in the deaths of 1,200 people.
We talked about Gaza last time and the inability to cover it in the way that you would like to. You can't get into Gaza. You can't go in without the IDF. Is that still the case? I assume that's still the case. And what was your experience of trying to get stories out of Gaza this time around?
No, I've spoken to people in Gaza constantly over the last 12 months. You can telephone people in Gaza and speak to people on WhatsApp, but it's communications are limited. Generally, we'll engage a fixer to go in and interview people and film them and send back vision. But it's difficult. People have got in on very limited embeds. CNN went in. Clarissa Ward, I noticed, went in to report from a hospital, but she was only there for about 2 hours. I think the Australian newspaper has got in for a couple of hours. You go in on a Israeli vehicle, interview some Israeli troops and commanders, and then you're driven out. So it's pretty limited. It's of limited value, but it's possible to go in after a lot of negotiations with the Israelis. But you'll only be able to speak to Israelis, so you're not allowed to talk to Gazans.
I guess my question then is, are you confident as a journalist that the information that we're getting about Gaza and about Israel is can be trusted and is fair.
Yeah, well, we as I said, we speak to people from Gaza all the time. You get their stories. It's not the same as being able to go in and tell them yourself. You're relying on locals and their contact networks to go and find people. But if if I request a story, I say, can you get into a refugee camp, find a family who've moved a couple of times, interview them, film them going and getting water, follow them for a day or so we know what their life is like. You'll get that material. So it's possible to get that information out. It's not a completely closed enclave in that sense.
Yeah.
You can't get in, they can't get out mostly, but you can get information out.
You actually, though, we went to Israel this time around to specifically cover the October 7 attacks with a specific focus on, and I want to talk, it's funny how you touched on earlier this new mood, I guess, and a potential rise in popularity for Benjamin Netanyahu because of his response to Hezbollah and because of how he's responding to Iran, but still a lot of anger at the government and at the IDF for the lack of response on October 7. Tell me about the experience of talking to people who lived in those kibbutzes during that day. We talked about it in April. There was no answers. It appears there's still no answers as to why the IDF wasn't able to help them more quickly. Yeah,
well, the IDF says it's in the process of conducting a bunch of inquiries into the attacks all around Gaza, but just one has been released, and it's like a 6-page summary really of what happened in kibbutz Beirut, which is a community of about 1,200 people, about 4 kilometres from Gaza. The people who live in those kibbutzes and those border communities are desperate to tell their stories and talk about what happened to them because they feel like their stories have been forgotten by the world as the war in Gaza has continued and kind of overwhelmed things, and now the war in the north. So when I was there, it's such a big story, and so many devastating things happened that day that it was important, I think, to have a bit of focus. So we focused on Beirut and what went on there. So we stayed in Tel Aviv and then went down every day to survivors and got them to tell us what happened to them. They're happy to talk, open, but most people are deeply traumatised. I mean, 101 people were killed in Beirut that day, 30 people were kidnapped, and about 35 soldiers were killed in the community trying to kick out Hamas. But they feel absolutely let down by the Israeli military because they were there. The first attackers came into the kibbutz at 6:30 in the morning, and the military didn't come in force until about 12 hours later, and that is astonishing in a nation where the Israeli military was always seen as this powerful, reliable force that would protect people in case of attack. And they just didn't that day. They were completely overwhelmed. Communications broke down. All these bizarre things happened, like roadblocks stopping troops from getting in. Everyone gathered at nearby points, but private civilians were able to get in and out and rescue people. So I went and met a guy called Israel Ziv, who's a former Israeli general, and he was, on the morning of October 7, he was riding his mountain bike in the hills outside Tel Aviv. He's in his early 60s, a barrel-chested, fit guy.
Yeah.
And so he
pretty matter of fact from the report.
Yeah. Well, he got a phone call saying, have you seen what's going on? Because the Israeli media was covering it from the first moments, and all those WhatsApp videos of what were going on were being shared, Facebook videos, live streams. So Israel knew what was going on, the civilians. So Israel Ziv got this phone call. He said, I've never pedalled so fast in my life, as he rode back to his house, went home, put on his military uniform, which he kept in his cupboard even though he's a retired general. He's not an active soldier. strapped on his pistol and drove down in his white Audi the 90 minutes on these empty Saturday morning highways, because it was a public, not just the Shabbat morning in Israel, which is quiet anyway, but it was also the Rosh Hashanah holiday, the end of a 3-day holiday period. So there was nobody on the road. So he roared down and pretty much drove straight into some Hamas ambushes on this Highway 232 that runs past all of these kibbutzes. And tells this incredible story of basically fighting his way into the Nova Music Festival site, which is where 364 Israelis were killed, not just Israelis as well, people from all around the world, and Israeli Arabs and Palestinians who were working there were also killed. And so he was one of the first people who got there. The military wasn't there. The police weren't there. There were some police who were guarding the site, private security during the event, but they were killed straight away. So Israel Ziv turns up, and he said he just went from body to body to body, trying to find someone who was alive, and he reckons he probably touched about 60 bodies, shaking people, trying to work out if someone was injured or pretending to be dead. And then he decided to go to kibbutz Beirut when he couldn't find anyone who was alive. And in the early evening, so about 6 p.m., this is 12 hours after the first Hamas attackers had entered the kibbutz, he got to the gates and found a lot of troops waiting outside, and they weren't doing anything.
Israeli troops.
Troops, yeah. They hadn't gone in force. He went up to the commander and said, "Hi, I'm here to help. Any help you want, I can give you." And the commander said, "Oh, we're preparing to go in." Then after 10 or 15 minutes, nothing had happened. So he went up to him again and said, "Okay, what are you doing? There's people dying in there. We know from WhatsApp calls and phone calls from family that people are hiding in their safe rooms, and terrorists are going from room to room shooting people and kidnapping them." And the general said, or the commanding officer said, "We're give me a minute. I'm still preparing our response." And so this happened again. So he watched this kind of inept, slow response. And eventually they did go in, as Ziv and a couple of other people were nagging this commander. And when they went in, they just went in as kind of individual hostage rescue missions. So the troops, even though there were something in the order of 500 troops outside the kibbutz gates, they'd just send a squad in at a time to go to a house where they knew there were people, and they'd pull those people out and bring them back. And Ziv said he was sitting there watching these squads come back with a couple of wounded soldiers and then carrying some civilians or walking with civilians. He said it was just the totally wrong approach to take. They didn't realise, and this happened right across Israel that day, they didn't realise they were at war. They thought they were dealing with isolated groups of terrorists.
And the context on that is that there was, and I think this is, in some ways what we don't appreciate, there was 30 breaches of the border. As I understand, something like 30.
They blew the fence in 29 different places, and then they attacked more than 50 individual locations,
which
so
I think
military bases as well.
We had a real focus on that, the music festival, of course, but I think your report and others that have come out a year on really clearly demonstrates just how big this was. And there's still no answers as to why they responded the way they did.
No, there's just this one limited report, which has generalities in it. It says the reason that the response was so slow was that there were so many different attacks in so many places, and the lines of communication were poor. And they do acknowledge that troops were waiting outside. Certainly Beirut and probably other places without going in, and that army units were concentrating on defending their own positions rather than going in and assisting in these places where civilians were still hiding. There were still people in the bushes at Nova. There were still terrorists wandering around, killing people at will. There was still kidnappings going on.
I guess the other thing I didn't appreciate as well is that then there was people crossing the border to, raid homes and take things and
the mob followed the attackers. The first wave of Hamas came in and they were pretty readily identifiable with uniforms and weapons. And then there was a larger group of people that came in, and that second wave is responsible for some of the worst atrocities. People listening might have seen some of those videos of Asian farm workers being killed with hoes, with rakes and things like that. That wasn't the first wave of attackers. That was the unarmed civilians who followed in. And that was raised over and over again by Israelis, a lot of whom have, let's say, little sympathy for what's going on in Gaza, or limited sympathy. And I think a lot of that stems from the fact that there was a broad group of civilians who came in and looted and murdered and, we believe also sexually assaulted people as well.
What was the relationship between those on the border of Gaza and Israel like before October 7?
Well, mixed. There were some people, like a woman I spoke with, Nili Bar Sinai, who said that she thought that Israelis who had, kind of sympathetic relationships with Gazans and Palestinians were naive. But these communities, the nature of the communities close to Gaza, it's kind of left-wing Israelis. These are the kibbutzes, especially. They're it's communal living, where if you have a job outside of the community, you're expected, your income goes into a pool and is then shared.
In action, in the way that it was supposed to be.
That's right.
Yeah,
kind of agrarian socialism.
Yeah,
and so you have people. You don't get your far right residents living in these places. They're left wing Israelis, and so you had lots of people like Vivian Silva, who was one of the best known people who was killed early on, who'd go into Gaza and assist people there. And as the relationship deteriorated from 2006 onwards between Gaza and Israel, Palestine and Israel, they would do things like go to the border, collect Israelis who needed collect Palestinians who needed medical care, and drive them to Israeli hospitals. So there was this connection between the people who lived in that community and Palestinians. They had, if not friendships, certainly good relationships with many Palestinians. And you saw that in some of those videos, some of the hostage videos and things that were being recorded on October 7. People saying, "I have Palestinian friends. I don't kill me. Don't capture me. I've helped people here," and that it didn't help them at all.
There are two things we know about you. One, you're busy. Two, you love a quiz. So we're pointing you in the direction of one from GoTo that will customize a skincare routine just for you. Head to gotoskincare.com. A link to that is in your episode notes, and answer a few quick questions about what you're after in a skincare routine. GoTo will sort you out in no time. Helpful and uncomplicated. It's kind of like your shortcut to skincare. What you've described, I guess, just to zoom out a little bit, is a lot of people very angry at the government for that day and what happened on that day. Can they separate that, I guess, break of trust? Because they did have a lot of trust that and you see that in some of the way that they talk about, well, we just expected the military would come, like they'll come and save us, and then hours passed and they didn't. Do they still have any trust in the government to protect them? And I'm thinking about, can the Iron Dome stand up? Do they believe that's the case? Is there a breaking of that trust?
Well, there's certainly there's two separate breaches of trust, I suppose. There's the government on one hand and the military is always seen as independent of the government, and they're certainly in those left-wing communities. People there don't like Benjamin Netanyahu, never have, certainly didn't like the way the Israeli government was what Israel Israel's leadership was becoming this kind of these alliances between Netanyahu and extremists in Israel, the far right, the equivalent of Pauline Hanson here in Australia, or worse, who was in the cabinet. You have kind of pro-settler, extreme Zionists, which is probably not the appropriate word to use, but extremists who want Israelis to live in the West Bank, who are pushing that kind of expansion of settlements, who are now inside the government. The police minister, the finance minister are as far right as you can possibly go, and so there is those two issues. There's the army and then there's the government, and both. There was a loss of faith in the government, I think, a long time ago from a big proportion of the Israeli public. But it was this failure of the army that really shocked people.
It's interesting, that separation. Just to my question, I guess, I mean, more broadly, let's zoom way out of that progressive left-leaning kibbutz communities and just talk about Israel more broadly. If they're being attacked by Iran, by Hezbollah, by Hamas, potentially by others, can it stand up? Like, do they feel safe? Does it feel safe there?
I think Israel has faith that its military can deal with those
missile attacks
with Hezbollah, with Hamas, and with Iran. Yeah.
Okay.
I think most people feel like America will come to its aid as well if Iran attacks in force. Whether we've seen this situation over the last 12 months where most of the missiles that have come into Israel have been knocked down by the Iron Dome system. And when I was there, it was amazing. I was going for a walk one morning in Tel Aviv, which is a long way from the northern border, and the rocket alarms went off and everyone started running. I thought, is this normal? What do I do? So I just poked my head into a 7-Eleven, sort of stood out of the way, and I just looked up and saw this little puff of smoke in the sky where a missile had been knocked out by the Iron Dome. It turned out that missile had come from Yemen, from the Houthis. But then we had this attack the other night where we had 180 missiles come over, and that in places overwhelmed the Iron Dome system. So there were about 20 rockets that were targeting a particular Israeli military base, and a lot of those got through. It's a good system, but it's not. It has its limitations, certainly against the faster cruise missiles and missiles in great numbers. There's just not enough time to try and knock all of those out. The slower ones that were coming from Gaza and from Lebanon, it can deal with. So, it can certainly get worse for Israel.
You spent a good portion of your time as a foreign correspondent out of Beirut. We talked about that when you came in April, and I encourage people to listen to. Your love of Beirut was very real, and you spoke about it very fondly. You also clearly articulated, I think, what a melting pot it is. I think you said some 18 religions. Maybe melting pot's the wrong word because I'm not sure how much everyone mixes. Would that be fair to say?
Yeah, I mean, maybe in the bars in Jamaica you might get a bit of a mix amongst the young community or the nightclubs. But yeah, the communities are quite separate. I mean, we see now that there's 1 million people displaced on that southern border with Israel. Over 1,000 killed at this point. We see Australians evacuating. How critical is it that Australians get out? How do you see that shaking out for people there? Oh, I think it's going to get worse. I don't think Israel is going to move out of the south for a long time. They're talking about just limited raids, limited incursions, but there's a river that runs about 10 kilometres north of the border called the Litani River, and Israel's aim, I think, is to clear most people out of that zone in the south. So all of those people are being pushed north and are heading up to Beirut. There's some big cities down there, Sidon and Tyre, ancient cities, biblical places that are famed for their crusader castles, amazing, seaside towns with incredible history that are being emptied as we speak. And then north of the Litani River, So I don't think anyone will be going back anytime soon. The airstrikes at the moment are mostly on the Dahieh, which are the Shia suburbs in Lebanon south. In Beirut south. But Beirut is a small city, geographically small. It's much smaller than Sydney. So the airport is about 4 or 5 kilometres south of the city centre, maybe it's slightly further than that. And between the airport and the city centre is the Dahieh, which are these Hezbollah-controlled areas where Hassan Nasrallah was killed in an airstrike early on, the leader of Hezbollah, and we're now getting nightly strikes. But some of the airstrikes are hitting suburbs much closer in, the Kola and suburbs that are a stone's throw from the heart of town.
What is your experience of Hezbollah, having reported out of there for 3 or 4 years? They hold many seats in parliament, I think less so than they did when you were based there, but they still are a very big, powerful force in Lebanon. Can you explain Hezbollah to us?
Well, Hezbollah and its allies control more than half of the seats in the Lebanese parliament, but the concept of Lebanon as an effective state and effective government, it doesn't really exist. The real power there is Hezbollah. And you can say that there is a Lebanese army and a Lebanese police force, but they're very ineffective. And there's sort of a couple of old rusting tanks, and I think they have one plane, the Lebanese Air Force, a couple of helicopters that are forever out of service, and I think they were making money by giving tourist rides when I was there. So the effective military force is Hezbollah. There are some Christian militias as well, and during the Civil War, the Christians and the Druze communities and the Shias and the Sunnis were all fighting each other. So each community is protected by its own militias if it came down to it. But Hezbollah is a Iranian-backed, Iranian-funded political and military organisation. It runs hospitals, it runs schools,
charities. I read.
It controls certainly the south of Beirut and the south of the country. Nothing happens in those places without Hezbollah's approval. You'd be very foolish to go in and try and do something that was against Hezbollah's interests. Those southern suburbs are controlled by Hezbollah. You need permission to go into them. If you pulled out a camera, you get people coming up to you within a minute or two with pistols in their waistbands. If you wanted to go south and film, you had to have layers of permission, one from the Israeli military, from the Lebanese military, and then as you move further south from Hezbollah itself.
So the concept of freedom in the way that we know it is not something that exists in that part of the world. And I think that brings me to, we've seen people here in Australia disagreeing with the label of terrorist organisation for Hezbollah. We've seen the flying of those flags minimally, but it's happened. Even just watching people interviewed as part of the protests on the weekend.
It's certainly a terrorist organisation.
I think, what would you say to that? And I guess, did you expect that from people who live in Australia?
You only have to look at what they've done over the last year, which is firing unguided rockets into civilian communities. And, you can make arguments about whatever it is that Israel's doing and the labels you want to give it, but Hezbollah is certainly a terrorist organisation. It's in its various iterations over the years, it's been responsible for bombings, for the Marine barracks bombing in Israel in 1983. I think it was called Islamic Jihad back then, not Hezbollah. It's really the organisation that is responsible most for the survival of Assad in Syria, because when the Syrian rebels were
Assad being the leader of the Syrian regime.
That's right. Who really is one of the world's most atrocious dictators. He's allied with Iran. When the Syrian civil war was going on, it was Hezbollah that saved Assad and ended the kind of the Arab Spring in Syria anyway.
I guess on the other side, so there are obviously those people here in Australia and around the world that disagree with everything you've just said. But on the flip side, there's many people who are saying, look, Israel's fighting for all of us. They're fighting for the West. Would that be your characterization of what's happening?
Look, I think it, I certainly understand. I suppose my sympathy lies with the civilians from both communities, from the people of northern Israel, the people of Gaza, the people of the kibbutzes who live on the border with Gaza, the people of southern Lebanon. They're the victims of this, terrible situation in the Middle East that's been going on now for not just since 1948, but since really the time of Jesus and the destruction of the Second Temple by the Romans in it's AD 60. But Israel is threatened by its neighbours. Groups like Hezbollah and Hamas want to wipe it out, and they don't really care what happens to the Israelis. They just don't want them there. Israel is a functioning democracy. It's functioned at some times better than others. There's a reason why Western nations are allied with Israel and not Hezbollah and Hamas.
I guess that brings me to my final question for you was, a lot of what we see in the news is two sides in absolute disagreement with each other, whether that be Hamas versus Israel or Iran versus whatever the two sides are, just complete disagreement, complete inability to understand the other's point of view. But are you saying that most people sit somewhere in the middle, sort of horrified by it all, understanding the grey areas?
Some people, if we're talking about people in the Middle East, many Israelis certainly have great sympathy for what's happening to the Palestinians in Gaza. Some Israelis don't at all. They think they've brought it onto them for themselves by supporting a group like Hamas, even though many Palestinians would say they have no choice.
Do you think
just trying to get on with their lives.
Do you think the majority still hope it can be resolved peacefully, or is that a completely naive position to take at this point?
Look, I don't know what the prospects are of the thing that everybody says and has been saying since 1948 as the only solution for Israel has been a two-state solution. It's very difficult to see how two states, a separate Israel and a separate Palestine, would actually happen. So you get this. It's really a cliche now. The only solution is a two-state solution. But there are now 500,000 Israeli settlers in the West Bank. Just removing, I think, less than 10,000, maybe 6,000 settlers from Gaza back in the early 2000s was led to this enormous schism and Israel tearing itself apart, really, and the removal of those settlers and the return of sort of power to Palestinians and elections in Gaza led to the rise of Hamas and the situation that we're seeing now. It's very difficult to imagine a situation where Israel allows or pushes its settlers out of the West Bank to allow the creation of a Palestinian state. I think you're much more likely to see, a very complex web of enclaves and military roads and limited autonomy by the Palestinian Authority. It's incredibly complicated, and as Benjamin Netanyahu and his right-wing cronies encourage more and more settlers to move into the West Bank, a two-state solution is less and less likely. Would you say, just to finish, that Benjamin Netanyahu, as I sort of alluded to before, has rising popularity? He does, yeah. He was dead man walking, I think, for the first months after. I think you might have actually said that when we spoke in April. You said that support for him is waning. Yeah. But is that he's turned that around? Yeah. Well, as the war's gone on and a level of faith has been restored, I think, in the Israeli military, a degree of faith as they've become more and more effective in Gaza anyway. His popularity has grown his likely successor 10 months ago was a guy called Benny Gantz, who has turned out to be a terrible politician. He's a former general, but people held out great hope that he would be the person who would be able to stand up to Netanyahu and eventually bring together a coalition. But of other politicians that would allow him to form a government, but that hasn't happened. And really, Netanyahu is a much better politician, a smarter politician, and his alliances have become stronger to the point where he may not need those right-wing people for much longer. But Netanyahu isn't finished.
Thank you for listening to the end. This is a really heavy and hard topic. We know there are many and varied perspectives on this. We're grateful to Adam for bringing his. Next week, it's Media Literacy Week. Tanya Notley is my guest, a research professor focused on digital inclusion and media literacy. No doubt, the way we receive information is one of the biggest news topics of the year. AI, fake news, and having an informed nation is something you've indicated are really important to you. So we go to the experts. We'll get rid of the jargon and we'll talk about the problem and how she sees some of the solutions. Thanks for listening to News Club, and if you enjoyed this episode, please share it with someone.